From the Toronto Star, I'm Rudgy Mudler, and this matters. Toronto is a pink kush town. That's the most popular strain of weed being sold in the cannabis shops around town. And if you've walked through some of our busiest streets, you know it's not possible to flick a burnt roach without hitting one. 3 years after cannabis legalization, the growth of multiple weed shops beside each other in the city is enough to make you think, what are all these guys smoking? How can they survive with so much competition sandwiched right next door to each other? The truth is, they probably can't. But that's not going to stop more from coming. Jennifer Pagliaro is a City Hall reporter at the Star, and she recently tackled the question that many of us have had while walking these city streets and often noticing a very familiar odor. She joined us to discuss what is up with all the pot shops in town. Jen, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Jen, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. It's been 3 years since cannabis legalization, and sort of my running joke throughout this has been that it's only the government that can lose money selling weed. Now, that's obviously not true, but let's start with a little bit of history. When weed was first legalized, stores were awarded with a lottery system, right?
Yeah, so the first wave of licenses was through this kind of bizarre licensing scheme. And since then, starting in January 2020, the province decided that wasn't really working. There was a lot of complaints about that system. And so now it's opened up for applications.
Okay, so anyone who lives in Toronto has noticed the proliferation of cannabis stores. Let's just start with the facts. How many are in the city and overall in the province of Ontario?
So the province actually just celebrated 1,000 new stores, and that seems like a really big number. But what I'm hearing from experts is that that might actually be the minimum of what this province could potentially sustain. And we'll get into that. Now, Toronto specifically is home to almost a third of those. We're around the 300 mark, but that's just the ones that are authorized to open, meaning that they're already open or are legally allowed to open their doors, tomorrow. There are another almost 200 that could open because they are in the licensing process. They have an application in, it's being reviewed, and so that number could quickly become 500.
Jen, we got to get to the issues around this. I mean, everyone's walking around the city. In your story, you talk about Ossington. I live on Queen East. Literally, on my block, there's about 5 within 2 minutes of each other. First off, how is this happening? How can so many of these things pop up? But the question is why are there also so many clusters so close together?
Yeah, talking to retailers in the last little while, there was this idea, especially when everything started with that lottery system, that people really wanted to get in. It became sort of this like alluring thing that people thought they could make big money off of. And that's not just the big cannabis guys, the ones who got in on the production distribution side. That's like your average person who's thinking like, I can invest my life savings, I can try to get backing for this, and I can open a store, and this can be, my golden ticket. And so you had people putting in applications at a time when there wasn't really a lot of stores, and you have competing applications for the same areas like Queen West, Queen East, the Danforth, anywhere that listeners are, there's probably a big cluster. And it's because they put in applications. Those applications took a long time to filter through the process, and you didn't necessarily know exactly who your competition was going to be, or that they would be literally in the street or the block or the actual building next to you. And that's what's happening, where not only are you seeing, more than one shop on the same block. In the area that I looked at, Queen West, you have 2 sections where there's actually 2 side-by-side stores. And that's obviously become a huge issue for those retailers, mostly though for those small retailers, what I'm calling kind of the independent or entrepreneur retailers, because like any sector, you have big players. There are now massive chain stores, on the strip I looked at, and probably I know the listeners have seen a store called Tokyo Smoke. That's the biggest player in the city. They have 19 stores open in the city, and they have 8 applications in. So you're looking at a chain like that, small guy can't compete. Like look at any other industry, burgers, fashion, you're seeing a lot of the same issues, but it's partly a result of how the province set up this system for retail.
Oh, I really want to get into that. But I think the two fascinating things in your story to me was one, all of the data, and two, just a little breakdown of these rules, of which there really aren't very many. Can we talk a little bit about how sort of Wild West this is and some of the issues in trying to make these changes? Because it seems to me like these laws just aren't on the books yet, or that there's no mechanism to fix things.
Yeah, so there really are no rules in Ontario about how close stores can locate to one another, how many stores can be on a single block, or even how many stores can be in any one municipality. So there's no cap on the number of stores in Toronto. Any number of stores can locate on the same block. That's why you're getting stores located right beside each other. It's important to note that that's not the case in other jurisdictions. In Calgary, for example, there are distancing rules. There are like buffer zones, they call them, around stores where they can't be located within 300 meters of one another. So that gives you a little bit of breathing room. We don't have any of that here. The only distance rule in Ontario is that a store has to be located at least 150 meters from a school. That is, one of those rules that they put in place to try to prevent enticing young people, underage people, to get into cannabis. And the interesting thing about there not being a cap, when a lot of people in Toronto are looking at this and saying like, hey, there is way too many stores here, you really have to look at what the point of legalization was. And from the government's perspective, whatever you or I think, it's really a public safety and a public health policy. They wanted to find a way to provide regulated, tested cannabis so that you knew what you were getting and that it had a regulated amount of THC. That's like the active component in weed. And they wanted to get rid of the illegal market and all of the associated ills that might come with that. And when you look at the numbers, and these are numbers that the government is tracking, there is an Ontario cannabis store. Think of it as like the LCBO of weed. They actually say that the illegal market still represents over half of all of the cannabis sales in the province. So when you think about the goal of tapping the illegal market, we're not there yet. And so from the OCS's perspective, they're in like growth mode. They're like, let's go. We need to get more retail. We need to put legal weed in every block, in every municipality, to make it accessible to those who would otherwise be buying from their illegal source. And that has created this conflict where you see the concentration of stores in Toronto and you do see gaps in other places. Mississauga, for example, actually doesn't allow cannabis retail in their city because the province gave municipalities the option to opt out. And that has created a kind of gap in that marketplace. If you are a Mississauga resident and maybe you're listening to this podcast, you have to go to Brampton or into Toronto to get your legal weed. And so maybe you don't want to travel that far. So there's still a lot of problems with the way the system is set up. And it is creating this issue of clustering and the lack of rules and regulation around the number of stores is the product.
Well, I want to be very clear about something. To sort of get more of these stores out there, they don't really differentiate anyway from any other sort of retail outlet, right? Like a weed store is exactly like a nail salon, is exactly like a convenience store, basically, right?
That's right. I think the province was worried that they would give municipalities the ability to opt in, but maybe a municipality like Mississauga would opt in, but say, okay, but cannabis stores, you can't locate here, there, or elsewhere. And so you'd relegate cannabis stores to kind of like back alleys. And then what would the point be? And so the rules very specifically say that municipalities cannot pass bylaws that treat cannabis stores differently. So you're right. You have to treat a cannabis store, if you're, Toronto City Council, like a shoe store or any kind of other outlet that you would see on a main street.
We'll be right back. So now this is obviously manifesting it in terms of competition between these stores. I think I've seen lots of sales amongst them and a lot of people talking about a race to the bottom. Talk to me a little bit about that. And then, of course, the real follow-up question is, can they all survive?
Yeah, the retailers I talk to are pretty frustrated with the system. The lack of distance between them has meant that you are competing sometimes with the store literally next door. And when you look at the products that are available, so all of the products come through OCS, all of the stores buy their products from the cannabis store regulated by the province. And it's only right now around 1,600 unique items. That might sound like a lot. I went and looked. The LCBO, just for comparison, has around 31,000 unique products. So you're still dealing with a pretty small number of items that each store can sell. So a lot of them are all selling, the most popular products. So when you go from store to store, you're kind of getting the same thing. So the only way to really differentiate themselves is to offer some kind of discount. But they're all buying the weed at the same price from the OCS. So what the small retailers are telling me is that these large chains are the only ones that have the capital and the resources to offer these really steep discounts. You've probably seen a lot of them have like discount clubs now, where if you're a member, you can get a certain amount, at a certain price. And that's really hurting independent retailers who can't afford to pay rent if they offer these kinds of discounts.
You talked about the structural issues about this. And I remember, as you well know, everybody in our place works weekend shifts. And I remember one of my weekend shifts right after legalization, I think I was set to cover the opening of the fourth pot shop that opened in the city. It was like, ooh, we have four. Go cover it for the day. That was a news story. I talked to these owners too. They were all betting on the hopes of marketing a beautiful, clean in-store experience. Well, I think the thing right now is like they basically all look exactly the same. And then you just said it, they all have the exact same products. Can these guys differentiate from each other?
It's really hard. One of the retailers I spoke to, Dimes Cannabis on the Queen West Strip, he has a lot of experience in the hospitality and service industry. And so he's trying to market his store as more of a lifestyle brand. It's more than just the weed that he's selling. And it's working for him as a small retailer. He has 2 stores. But for a lot of independent retailers, they've put like their heart and soul, some of them, into the designs and the art in these buildings. And some of them are really beautiful. Like I would encourage people, even if you're not buying cannabis, to go in and look at some of these stores, because you actually can't see a lot of them from the street. And so it's worth walking in if you're of age. But it's hard because a lot of these small stores are not going to be able to survive on marketing alone when the chain shop is selling the same product that they are. One of the wildest things that one of the retailers told me, Ashley Newman owns 2 stores called Queen of Bud. One is on Queen West, and she owns another flagship store in Calgary. She actually has a distribution, like a growing business, and they create their own line, Queen of Bud products. She can't create an exclusive line of products to sell in her own store because of the regulations in Ontario. She has to sell her product to the OCS. Then the OCS in turn offers that to anyone who wants to buy that item. And she has to buy her own product from the OCS to sell in her own store. She can't actually directly ship her product from her production center to her own store. And I think that really illustrates a lot of the evolution that is still needed in this industry for it to make sense to retailers like Ashley.
That sounds like a scheme coming from someone who's smoking their own product. I'm just kidding. Here's the thing. You also talked on this on a city planning level, and you talked to some people like city planners. Like, obviously, there's no controls. We have these clusters of stores. Why is this something that's worrying planners and people who are trying to build a city?
Yeah. So like when you think about city planners, I often like to tell people, if you've ever played Sim City, it's not that different, right? You want a mix of things in each neighborhood. Toronto's a big city. Remember, like we used to be many cities. And so you need like microcosms of grocery and bars and restaurants, entertainment. You need hairdressers and you want dry cleaners. And then you also want like fun stuff sprinkled in there. So I'll say that's kind of cannabis stores. Now, the issue with having too many cannabis stores in one block or one neighborhood is it crowds out some of those other businesses. And planners say that messes with the vitality of a neighborhood, that kind of livelihood that main streets bring to your community. At the same time, they don't really want to like police cannabis stores. They pointed out that like a lot of our best neighborhoods happened organically, like the entertainment district on King West and the fashion district on Queen, and that it loses some authenticity if you mess with it. And I've had other people at City Hall say to me, like, that's kind of an old way of thinking. We, for example, limited the number of bars and restaurants that could open in any one block in Parkdale because it was kind of taking over part of that neighborhood. And And some people say that was the right decision. It's not that we want to exclude bars or restaurants from Parkdale. Of course, there's tons, but we just don't want it to be the only or the dominant retail space. So when you think about like the health of a neighborhood, a planner would really say it's a mix of things. And the fact that it's not a mix right now in a lot of places is definitely worrying.
You mentioned it earlier. I just want to touch on it again. I would expect a lot of retailers being like, there's too many, but you talked to other guys saying that you need more to try and crush the illegal market. Is that actually a thing that's ever going to happen?
It's difficult. One of the industry folks I talked to brought up something really interesting that I had not considered, which is that it was only recently that the province allowed permanent delivery for retailers. And when you just stop to think about how people got their or still get their illegal weed, your dealer shows up at your door, you meet in a parking lot or like an agreed upon location that's convenient for you. And having to actually drive to the store, transit, or walk to the store is not convenient for a lot of people. And so allowing delivery is actually like a huge step, these industry guys say, in combating the illegal market. And we've only just seen retail stores like taking up the delivery model, especially like think outside Toronto for a second, smaller parts of Ontario that are less accessible by transit or by foot. That's a huge step. The other thing is that 1,000 stores sounds like a lot, but remember, about a third are in Toronto. Ontario is a huge province, and there are lots of places, if you look at a map of Ontario, where there are still huge gaps. Places like Mississauga, a major municipality in North America, is not allowing retail at all. So in order for them to actually get at that illegal market, you have to fill in those gaps, I think.
Are there any thoughts or any motion to change or tweak any of these rules, basically at any government level at this point?
So there is a private members bill that a NDP MPP has introduced at Queen's Park. And it's looking at giving municipalities more power over where these stores locate. Almost everyone I spoke to, almost without exception, said that they would like to see distance rules, not allowing stores to locate so close to one another, that buffer zone I was talking about that they have in Alberta. The issue is that we're unclear if the government is going to take the bill seriously. In a majority government, private members' bills often die. And so it's not clear if the government's going to take up that idea. They could do it on their own, of course, as well. They don't need a private members' bill to change the legislation, but it's whether or not they're going to listen to that idea or listen to the industry. That still remains to be seen.
It's been a fascinating thing watching this because, obviously there was a gold rush to begin, and now you just see these stocks not doing so well. And then again, you also see it on our streets. And I'm literally like, I don't understand how these people can stay in business all beside each other. Jen, this has been a fantastic interview for us. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think our listeners should know?
One of the things that a retailer said to me, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot, is that we're still really in the early stages of our legal weed journey. If you think about how long it's been that we've come to accept alcohol, like in the post-prohibition age, by comparison, this is still a very, very new thing for Canada and for Ontario and for Toronto. And so there is still hope amongst retailers and others deeply involved in this, that there is room and time to evolve. And I think for everyone's sake, I hope that's true. I think for our neighborhoods and communities and for the health of our businesses, especially coming through this pandemic, I think it would be great to see a success story in this new sector.
Jen, it's great for us. I really want to thank you for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Jennifer Pagliaro is a City Hall reporter at The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Raju Mudder. Our This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachneck, Saba Etizaz, and Sean Pattenden. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenden. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.